The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty airfield outside of Tucson in the spring of 1943. Thomas Broken Arrow stood alone beside a battered P-47 Thunderbolt, its fuselage scarred with dents and patches that told stories of near misses and hard landings. The other pilots called it the Boneyard Bird, a joke that wasn't entirely friendly. They said it belonged in the scrapyard, not on a battlefield. Thomas ran his calloused hand along the rough metal, feeling every imperfection. He was Apache, from the White Mountain Reservation, and he had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about warriors who turned weaknesses into strengths. This airplane, rejected and mocked, reminded him of those tales. Captain Richard Sterling stood with a group of pilots near the operations building, their crisp uniforms catching the light. They were the golden boys of the squadron, fresh from wealthy East Coast families, with connections that opened doors Thomas never even knew existed. Sterling's laugh carried across the tarmac as he pointed toward Thomas and his plane. "Come look at this, boys. The Indian and his junkyard special. Think they'll even make it off the ground?" The other pilots snickered. Thomas had heard worse. He had been hearing worse his entire life. At the reservation school, where teachers mispronounced his name and told him to forget his language. At the recruitment office, where the sergeant looked at him with surprise and said he didn't know they were taking Indians. Even here, among men who were supposed to be brothers in arms, he stood apart. But Thomas had something they didn't understand. His grandfather had taught him patience. His mother had taught him pride. And the Air Force had taught him to fly like his ancestors once rode across the open plains, with courage that couldn't be measured by the shine on your boots or the straightness of your part. Lieutenant James Morrison approached Thomas quietly. Morrison was different from the others. He was from a small town in Kentucky, the son of a coal miner, and he understood what it meant to be dismissed before you even opened your mouth. "Don't let them get to you, Broken Arrow. That bird might look rough, but I've seen you fly. You've got skills Sterling couldn't buy with all his daddy's money." Thomas nodded his appreciation but said nothing. Words were cheap. Results mattered. Tomorrow they would ship out for advanced combat training in preparation for the European theater. Tomorrow he would show them what the Boneyard Bird could really do. That evening, Thomas worked alone in the hangar while the others drank and played cards in the barracks. He studied every inch of his aircraft, making adjustments that the mechanics had overlooked. The P-47 was heavy and powerful, built like a tank with wings. Other pilots complained about its weight, preferring the nimble grace of the P-51 Mustang. But Thomas saw potential in that mass. Stability, durability, the ability to take punishment and keep flying. He thought about his younger brother, David, still back on the reservation, watching the skies and dreaming of the day he might follow Thomas into service. He thought about his grandmother, who had sewn a small medicine pouch that he kept in his flight jacket. She had told him that his ancestors would fly with him, that the spirit of the warrior never dies, it only changes form. The next morning brought the evaluation flights. Each pilot would demonstrate combat maneuvers, gunnery accuracy, and tactical decision-making. The squadron commander, Colonel Harrison, watched from the control tower alongside visiting brass from Washington. These evaluations would determine assignments for the upcoming invasion of Europe. The best pilots would lead fighter escorts. The rest would fly support missions or worse, get reassigned to training duties stateside. Sterling went first, executing a textbook series of barrel rolls and victory loops in his pristine Thunderbolt. The watching officers nodded approvingly. Morrison flew next, solid and competent, earning respectful silence from the crowd. Then it was Thomas's turn. As he taxied the Boneyard Bird to the runway, he heard the snickers over the radio frequency. Someone made a joke about smoke signals. Someone else wondered aloud if the plane would fall apart on takeoff. Thomas closed his eyes for just a moment, feeling the vibration of the engine, hearing his grandfather's voice telling him the old story about Coyote, who everyone underestimated until he used his cleverness to outsmart Bear. He opened his eyes, checked his instruments one final time, and pushed the throttle forward. The Boneyard Bird roared down the runway, shaking and rattling like it might disintegrate at any moment. But Thomas felt something the others couldn't see. He felt the heart of this machine, the stubborn refusal to quit that lived in every rivet and weld. As the wheels left the ground, he smiled. They wanted a show. He would give them something they would never forget. Thomas pushed the Thunderbolt into a steep climb, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. The Boneyard bird groaned and protested, but it climbed. At 8,000 feet, he rolled inverted and dove, picking up speed that made the control tower hold its collective breath. He pulled out low, barely 200 feet above the desert floor, then shot back up into a chandelle that displayed every ounce of the aircraft's raw power. But when he lined up for the gunnery run, something went wrong. The target sleeve, towed by another aircraft, was positioned for the standard approach. Thomas squeezed the trigger and felt the shudder of the 850 caliber machine guns. He expected to see the fabric target shred under the impact. Instead, only 3 guns fired. The others jammed, a common problem with the Boneyard bird that the mechanics could never quite fix. Over the radio, Sterling's voice crackled with barely concealed glee. "Looks like the Indians shooting blanks. Maybe he should try a bow and arrow instead." Laughter erupted across the frequency. Even some of the ground crew chuckled. Thomas felt heat rise in his face, not from anger at Sterling, but from the knowledge that he had just confirmed every doubt the officers in that tower held about him. A pilot who couldn't maintain his weapons systems was a liability, not an asset. He completed the rest of the evaluation in silence, landing the Boneyard bird with mechanical precision. As he climbed out of the cockpit, the other pilots were already walking away, their judgment written in their dismissive postures. Morrison lingered, offering a sympathetic look, but even he had nothing to say. Colonel Harrison called Thomas into his office that afternoon. The colonel was a career officer, a veteran of the First World War, with a face carved from hard experience and eyes that missed nothing. "Broken Arrow, I've read your file. Your flight skills are exceptional. Your dedication is beyond question. But that aircraft is a disaster waiting to happen. I'm recommending you be reassigned to a maintenance unit. We need good mechanics as much as we need pilots." The words hit harder than any insult Sterling had ever thrown. Thomas stood at attention, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Being grounded meant failing his family, his people. Everyone who had believed an Apache boy from the reservation could make something of himself in the white man's war. "Sir, give me one more chance. Let me prove what this aircraft can do, what I can do." Colonel Harrison sighed, shuffling papers on his desk. "The brass wants results, Lieutenant. They want pilots who can be relied upon in combat. That gun malfunction today could mean dead wingmen over France. I can't risk that." Thomas left the office knowing his dream was slipping away, killed not by lack of skill but by equipment that everyone had already written off as worthless, just like they had written him off. That night, Thomas sat alone in the hangar, staring at the Boneyard bird under the harsh fluorescent lights. His duffel bag was packed in the barracks. Tomorrow he would transfer to a maintenance depot in California, fixing other men's planes while they flew into glory. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but deeper than anger was something else: determination. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When the white soldiers came to our lands, they had better weapons, better supplies. But we knew the terrain. We understood that victory doesn't always go to those with the finest equipment. It goes to those who refuse to accept defeat." Thomas stood and approached the aircraft. He had been flying this plane for 6 months, learning its quirks and temperament. The gun jams weren't random. They happened when he fired in certain positions, when the G-forces combined with the worn feed mechanisms in a specific way. The mechanics saw it as a fatal flaw. Thomas saw it as a puzzle. He spent the entire night in that hangar, not sleeping, barely eating. He dismantled and cleaned each gun mechanism, adjusted the feed angles, and modified the ammunition belt routing using techniques he had learned from an old armorer on base who everyone else ignored. By dawn, his hands were black with grease and his eyes burned with exhaustion. But something fundamental had changed in the Boneyard bird's weapons systems. Morrison found him as the sun rose, looking concerned. "Broken Arrow, what are you doing? Your transfer orders came through. You're supposed to report at 0800. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag. his jaw set with quiet resolve. "I'm not going anywhere until I prove this bird can fight." Before Morrison could respond, air raid sirens shattered the morning calm. It wasn't a drill. Japanese submarines had been spotted off the California coast, and intelligence suggested possible air raids on West Coast military installations. Every available aircraft was being scrambled for coastal defense patrols. The hangar exploded into chaos. Pilots sprinted for their planes. Mechanics rushed to prep aircraft for immediate takeoff. In the confusion, Thomas made a decision that could end his career or save it. He climbed into the Boneyard bird's cockpit. Colonel Harrison's voice boomed across the tarmac. "Broken Arrow, you are not authorized for this mission. Stand down immediately." Thomas started the engine, the propeller spinning to life. Through his headset, he heard Sterling's mocking voice. "Let him go, Colonel. When the Indian crashes that piece of junk into the ocean, it'll solve everyone's problem." If you're still watching this story and want to see how Thomas proves everyone wrong, hit that subscribe button right now. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about courage. Thomas released the brakes and rolled toward the runway, knowing he had just bet everything on one final chance. The Boneyard bird lifted off into a sky painted with the colors of dawn, joining a formation of 12 Thunderbolts heading toward the coastline. Thomas fell into position on the far wing, where the least trusted pilots always flew. Sterling led the formation, his voice crisp and commanding over the radio as they climbed to 15,000 feet. The Pacific stretched endlessly below them, a vast mirror reflecting the morning light. For 30 minutes, they saw nothing but ocean and clouds. Then Morrison's voice cracked through the static. "Contacts, 11 o'clock low. Multiple aircraft." Thomas's heart hammered as he spotted them. Not Japanese aircraft, but something that made his blood run cold. 9 German Messerschmitt Bf 109s, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at distance. Intelligence had been wrong. This wasn't a Japanese raid. Somehow, impossibly, German fighters had reached American airspace, likely launched from a disguised supply vessel. Sterling's formation broke apart in confusion. These pilots had trained to fight Japanese Zeros, not the most feared fighters in the European theater. The Germans, experienced veterans from the Eastern Front, tore into the scattered American formation with brutal efficiency. Thomas watched 2 Thunderbolts go down in the first 30 seconds, trailing smoke and fire. Sterling's voice, no longer confident, screamed orders that nobody followed. The formation dissolved into individual dogfights, each pilot fighting for survival. A Messerschmitt latched onto Morrison's tail, cannon fire stitching across his wing. Thomas didn't think. He dove, pushing the Boneyard bird into a vertical drop that made his vision narrow and his teeth clench. The German pilot, focused on Morrison, never saw him coming. Thomas squeezed the trigger. All 8 guns roared to life, perfectly synchronized, the modifications he had made through the night proving flawless. The Messerschmitt exploded in a ball of orange flame. Morrison's grateful voice filled his headset. "Broken Arrow, you saved my life." But Thomas had no time to respond. 2 more German fighters were converging on Sterling's position. The captain's plane was damaged, smoke pouring from the engine, his flying erratic with panic. Thomas banked hard, feeling the Boneyard bird respond with a precision that surprised even him. The heavy Thunderbolt, which everyone mocked for its weight, became an advantage. While the nimble Messerschmitts danced through the sky, Thomas used the P-47's legendary durability and firepower like a hammer. He absorbed hits that would have destroyed lighter aircraft, his plane's thick armor plating protecting him as he closed to point-blank range. 1 German fighter fell, then another, then a third. Thomas flew like his ancestors had fought, using patience and precision, turning perceived weakness into strength. The Boneyard bird, scarred and battered, became an instrument of devastating efficiency in his hands. Each burst of gunfire was measured, each maneuver calculated. The remaining German pilots, recognizing a superior opponent, broke off and fled toward the horizon. Silence filled the radio frequency, broken only by heavy breathing and the sound of damaged engines struggling to stay airborne. The squadron limped back to base, their formation ragged and broken. Thomas flew close to Morrison, whose damaged Thunderbolt was losing altitude slowly but steadily. Through the radio, he talked his friend through every adjustment, every correction, guiding him home with the calm voice his grandfather had once used to teach him patience during long hunts in the mountains. "They're going to court-martial you for taking off without authorization," Morrison said, his voice tight with pain and exhaustion. "Even after what you just did." Thomas said nothing. He had made peace with whatever consequences awaited. He had proven what needed proving, first to himself, then to anyone willing to see. As the airfield came into view, emergency vehicles lined the runway. The entire base had gathered to watch them land. Thomas circled, allowing the more damaged aircraft to go first. Sterling's plane touched down hard, skidding sideways before coming to rest. Morrison landed next, his aircraft barely holding together. Finally, Thomas brought the Boneyard bird down, its landing gear groaning under the weight, bullet holes visible across the wings and fuselage. As he taxied to a stop and cut the engine, the silence felt overwhelming. He climbed out slowly, his legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. The ground crew stood frozen, staring at the battered aircraft that had just accounted for 5 confirmed kills against Germany's finest fighters. Thomas removed his flight helmet, sweat dripping down his face, and began walking toward the operations building where he assumed Colonel Harrison would be waiting with paperwork for his court-martial. Instead, the colonel stood at the base of the control tower, his stern expression unreadable. Behind him, the visiting officers from Washington watched with intense interest. Sterling stood to the side, his face pale, no longer the golden boy but just another pilot who had frozen when death came calling. "Broken Arrow," Colonel Harrison's voice carried across the tarmac. "You disobeyed a direct order." Thomas stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "You took an unauthorized aircraft into combat." "Yes, sir." The colonel stepped forward, and for the first time Thomas saw something in those hard eyes that hadn't been there before. Respect. "You also saved 6 pilots' lives, destroyed 5 enemy aircraft, and demonstrated the kind of courage and skill we desperately need for the invasion of Europe." The visiting officers stepped forward, and the senior among them, a general with 3 stars on his collar, spoke directly to Thomas. "Lieutenant Broken Arrow, effective immediately you are promoted to captain. You will lead your own fighter squadron in the European theater. And that aircraft," he pointed at the Boneyard bird, "goes with you. I want mechanics studying every modification you made. If one beaten-up Thunderbolt can do what we just witnessed, I want to know why." Sterling's face went white. Morrison grinned so wide it looked like his face might split. The mechanics burst into spontaneous applause. Thomas simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. His grandfather had been right. The warrior spirit never dies. It only changes form. Normandy, France. June 1944. Captain Thomas Broken Arrow led his squadron across the blood-soaked beaches where thousands of American soldiers fought their way inland. The Boneyard bird, now bearing the scars of dozens of combat missions and the painted talons of an Apache war eagle on its nose, cut through the smoke-filled sky with deadly purpose. Below, German Panzer tanks carved through Allied positions, their thick armor seeming invincible. But Thomas had learned something during his months in combat. Every tank had weak points. The engine decks, the thin top armor. You just had to have the patience to find them and the courage to get close enough. He dove through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, Morrison and his squadron following without hesitation. These men no longer saw him as the Indian with the junkyard plane. They saw him as the warrior who had brought them home alive from missions that should have killed them all. The Boneyard bird's 8 guns opened up, and the first Panzer erupted in flames. Thomas pulled up, banked hard, and dove again. Another tank destroyed, then another. The German armor, which had been unstoppable minutes before, now burned across the French countryside. By the time his ammunition was exhausted, 9 Panzers lay destroyed, their crews fleeing into the hedgerows. The Allied ground forces, who had been pinned down and facing annihilation, broke through the German lines. That evening, back at the forward airbase in England, Thomas sat on the wing of his aircraft, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. A letter from his brother David had arrived. He had enlisted and was training to be a pilot, inspired by stories of his older brother that had reached even the remote reservation. Morrison approached, now a captain himself, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "They say Eisenhower himself mentioned you in a briefing. The Apache warrior with the immortal Thunderbolt." Thomas smiled quietly. "It's not immortal. It's just determined. Like anyone who refuses to accept what others say they cannot do." Lieutenant Sterling, now transferred to a training command after repeatedly requesting to leave combat duty, had written a letter of apology that Thomas kept folded in his pocket. He bore no grudge. War had a way of showing people who they really were, and sometimes that revelation was harder than any bullet. 3 years later, Thomas would return home with a chest full of medals, including the Distinguished Service Cross. He would become a test pilot, helping design the jets that would define the next generation of air combat. The Boneyard bird would end up in the Smithsonian, a testament to the idea that greatness isn't about perfection but about heart. But on this evening in 1944, he was simply a warrior doing what warriors do, protecting his brothers and proving that courage has no color, no pedigree, and no price tag. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If this incredible true tale of courage and determination moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment telling us what other untold stories of World War II heroes you'd like to hear about. Your support means everything and helps us bring more amazing stories to light. See you in the next video.